The day following the Hiroshima bombing, Moscow remained enveloped in the weariness of war. However, within the Kremlin's stone walls and the gray corridors of the Soviet General Staff, an unprecedented tremor coursed through. Urgent reports flooded in from the Soviet embassy in Washington, and from news agencies that had disseminated President Truman's announcement. The United States had unleashed a single bomb, resulting in the complete incineration of a Japanese city. Soviet officers, battle-hardened from years of fierce combat against the Wehrmacht, paused in astonishment. They had observed artillery barges decimate towns. They had witnessed the Luftwaffe reduce villages to ashes, yet they had never encountered a weapon capable of instantly annihilating a city housing hundreds of thousands. It was as though the principles of warfare had been rewritten overnight, with the new dictates not governed by tanks or divisions, but by something unseen, divine, and terrifying. Within hours, urgent meetings were called. Officers who had recently returned from Berlin and Prague were summoned alongside scientists who had been discreetly engaged in uranium research within clandestine Soviet institutes. The primary objective was to verify the claims. Was it truly feasible? Some senior generals dismissed the American announcement, positing that it was mere propaganda intended to intimidate both Japan and the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, fragments of intelligence had long suggested something remarkable. The term Manhattan Project had emerged in encrypted communications, and rumors regarding extensive secret laboratories in the deserts of New Mexico were not entirely unfamiliar. For the Soviet officers, the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima had transitioned from mere rumor to stark reality, casting its shadow directly over Red Square. The psychological ramifications were immediate and catastrophic. Officers who were used to strategizing in terms of divisions, artillery calibers, and tank production suddenly confronted a weapon that rendered such calculations obsolete. A single whispered remark documented in an internal memorandum encapsulated the situation. If they possess 10 of these, we find ourselves defenseless. In the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Soviet intelligence hurried to collect every fragment of information, including blast radius, casualty figures, and the unusual new illnesses reported among survivors. It was not merely the devastation of infrastructure that shocked them, but the insidious poisoning of the human body through radiation that left officers in disbelief. The idea that a soldier could survive the explosion, yet succumb weeks later to unseen burns, troubled the Red Army more than any weapon they had ever faced. In the dining halls and smoking areas of Moscow's military establishments, speculation ran rampant. Young officers drew rudimentary diagrams of mushroom clouds on napkins, debating how high a bomber would need to ascend to deliver such a weapon over Moscow or Leningrad. Some calculated the number of aircraft necessary to obliterate the Soviet rail system. Others discussed whether anti-aircraft guns could intercept them in time. None of the responses provided any solace. The vast scale of America's industrial power, already evidenced by its unending supplies of trucks, fuel, and airplanes during the war, now appeared even more formidable when combined with the capacity to mass-produce atomic bombs. What troubled the officers the most was the timing. Just days prior, Stalin had commanded preparations for a Soviet offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria. Now America had unveiled a weapon capable of determining the outcome of the war independently, without the involvement of the Red Army. The geopolitical ramifications were clear. The United States had demonstrated not only to Japan, but to the world, and especially to the Soviet Union, that it held a monopoly on a weapon capable of shifting the global balance in an instant. Soviet officers immediately recognized that their nation's hard-won sacrifices on the Eastern Front could be eclipsed in historical accounts by a single American bomb. In private discussions, some generals expressed fear in ways they had never done when confronting the Wehrmacht. In their struggle against Hitler's forces, they had depended on sheer numbers, resilience, and the expansive geography of Russia to wear down the enemy. However, in the face of America's atomic bomb, no such defense appeared feasible. The prospect of Moscow becoming another Hiroshima was no longer a distant thought. It was a scenario they were compelled to envision in unsettling detail. One officer candidly noted in his diary that for the first time, He felt wars might no longer be waged by soldiers, but rather by fire itself. Although Stalin maintained an outwardly calm demeanor, he understood the gravity of the situation. He directed his closest aides to compile reports from all available sources, including diplomatic communications, espionage networks, and scientific evaluations. Soviet officers observed his silence with apprehension, aware that beneath his composed facade, Stalin was already reassessing the entire military strategy of the Soviet Union. If America possessed such formidable power, then the vast numbers of the Red Army and their extensive arsenal might suddenly hold little significance. A new era had commenced, and the Soviet officer corps, from the highest-ranking generals to the youngest lieutenants, could feel it with a blend of fear and resolute determination. By the end of August 1945, the military leadership of the Soviet Union had come to a sobering agreement. The atomic bomb was not a mere threat. It was a reality. It was catastrophic, and unless the USSR discovered a means to counter it, the future of their nation was precariously at stake. The officers who had triumphantly marched into Berlin just weeks earlier now found themselves gazing into a chasm of uncertainty. The world had transformed in an instant, and they recognized that they were already lagging behind. In the weeks following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Soviet intelligence officers operated at an intense pace. In Moscow, the corridors of the NKVD and GRU were alive with activity as couriers delivered piles of interrogation transcripts, coded messages, and hastily assembled reports from agents dispersed throughout Europe, Asia, and America. One of the most insightful sources of information emerged from repatriated Soviet prisoners of war and operatives who had either been detained or had infiltrated areas associated with Allied projects. These individuals, initially regarded merely as soldiers or spies returning from their duties, suddenly transformed into crucial witnesses to America's clandestine efforts. During rigorous debriefings, Soviet interrogators sought even the minutest details. A technician captured in Germany, who had previously worked in occupied France before being transported westward by the Americans, recalled overhearing murmurs about enormous facilities concealed in the American desert. Another prisoner spoke of endless train convoys transporting barrels of unfamiliar metal under stringent security. Initially, these fragments of testimony appeared disjointed, but collectively they illustrated a picture of something vast, an industrial undertaking unlike any other in history. Soviet officers, hardened skeptics of rumors, were astonished to discover that these pieces corresponded to the magnitude of effort necessary to produce such a catastrophic bomb. What most disturbed them was not merely the existence of the weapon, but the enormity of the American infrastructure supporting it. Interrogated scientists described laboratories the size of entire towns, secured compounds housing thousands of workers, and factories consuming unimaginable quantities of electricity. Soviet officers, accustomed to gauging power in terms of divisions of tanks and artillery, found it challenging to grasp the concept of a weapon that necessitated an empire of science and industry for its creation. They had witnessed America's economic strength during the war, with cargo ships laden with Lend-Lease trucks, aircraft, and fuel. However, this revelation confirmed that the Americans had leveraged those resources to an entirely unprecedented level. Agents returning from neutral nations also played a role in shaping the emerging narrative. Soviet operatives in Switzerland and Sweden reported overhearing discussions among American and British officers, boasting of a superweapon that had concluded the war in the Pacific. Some referred to uranium and plutonium, terms that were unfamiliar to many Soviet officers yet carried a sense of foreboding. The reports depicted scientists being protected more rigorously than generals in meetings where Allied leaders discussed the advent of a new era in warfare. Each cable that reached Moscow intensified the feeling of urgency. The Americans had developed something so formidable that conventional military reasoning appeared outdated. The most disturbing accounts came from Japanese survivors encountered by Soviet troops in Manchuria after August 1945. Refugees recounted cities transformed into desolate landscapes, children incinerated in moments, and survivors succumbing gradually to an unseen illness. Soviet officers listened in silence as physicians detailed unusual symptoms: hair loss, skin deterioration, and internal hemorrhaging that could not be attributed to typical injuries. These narratives horrified them more than the carnage of battle, because they indicated that the bomb's brutality persisted long after the initial detonation. It was not simply a tool of annihilation, but a means of prolonged suffering. In confidential meetings at military headquarters, officers meticulously examined these revelations. Late into the night, maps of the Soviet Union were laid out on tables, with red circles drawn to project the blast radius if bombs of the magnitude used on Hiroshima were detonated over Moscow, Leningrad, or Kiev. The findings were astonishing. Entire cities could be obliterated in mere minutes. Millions could perish. Command structures could be dismantled before any counteroffensive could be initiated. The prospect of their homeland rendered defenseless, unsettled officers, who had previously felt invulnerable after vanquishing the German war machine. The Red Army, triumphant and expansive, suddenly appeared vulnerable. As reports mounted, Soviet officers came to understand that they were not merely observing a new weapon, but the dawn of an entirely new epoch. The interrogation rooms resonated with disbelief, yet also with an increasing sense of urgency. If the Soviet Union did not act promptly, it risked becoming a second-rate power susceptible to American supremacy. The fear was tangible. For the first time since the October Revolution, officers expressed open concern that the very existence of the Soviet state could be jeopardized not by invasion, but by destruction from above. By late 1945, the sentiment among Soviet officers had transitioned from shock to a somber acceptance. They ceased to question the reality of the atomic bomb. Instead, their discussions revolved around the duration of America's monopoly on this weapon. Every officer recognized the stakes involved. Each year that passed without the development of a Soviet bomb increased the chasm between survival and annihilation. They were aware that Stalin was attentively listening, and they understood that their hushed anxieties would soon be transformed into directives that would mobilize the entire Soviet apparatus. However, during those initial months, as interrogation reports accumulated on desks in Moscow, Soviet officers remained troubled by the understanding that they were confronting a future entirely dictated by forces outside their influence. By the conclusion of 1945, Soviet officers had no doubts regarding the existence of America's atomic capabilities. What preoccupied them now was the overwhelming realization of how this arsenal had been constructed. The flow of intelligence obtained from prisoners, refugees, and intercepted communications was soon bolstered by much more accurate information. This intelligence stemmed from Soviet espionage activities deeply embedded within the core of the American nuclear initiative. In the dimly lit offices of Moscow, thick files marked with the term Sovetshchina Secret circulated among generals and senior officers. These documents bore the code name Manhattan Project. The information contained within was sufficient to render even the most battle-hardened commanders speechless. Soviet operatives had succeeded in infiltrating America's most closely guarded scientific endeavor, providing sketches, formulas, and first-hand accounts of laboratories that resembled cities more than mere research facilities. One officer, upon reviewing the documents for the first time, remarked with bitterness that the Americans had not only mobilized soldiers but also an extensive array of scientists, engineers, and industrial workers to develop their new weapon. The magnitude of this effort overshadowed anything the Soviet Union had attempted during the war. While the Red Army had deployed millions of troops against the Wehrmacht, the United States had discreetly assembled tens of thousands of physicists, chemists, and technicians under a shroud of secrecy. The most startling revelation emerged from intelligence reports detailing the resources utilized. Enormous factories were constructed in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, solely dedicated to the production of enriched uranium and plutonium. Each facility consumed enough electricity to power entire regions. For Soviet officers, who still recalled wartime shortages that plunged towns into darkness, this was nearly unfathomable. The Americans had not only created the bomb, they had done so with a lavish allocation of resources that only an economy free from invasion could sustain. One report estimated that the Manhattan Project had incurred costs exceeding $2 billion. For officers who gauged military strength by the number of tanks or artillery pieces, the notion of investing such a vast sum in a single weapon was astonishing. What left the greatest impression on them was the organizational discipline that underpinned the project. Soviet documents detailed General Leslie Groves, the resolute military overseer of the Manhattan Project, who managed everything from laboratory research to uranium shipments with unyielding efficiency. For Soviet officers accustomed to chaos and improvisation on the battlefield, the American capacity to plan and execute such a monumental endeavor in complete secrecy was nearly as terrifying as the bomb itself. The reports underscored that America's success was not merely a stroke of genius, but rather a systematic mobilization of knowledge, wealth, and determination on a scale the Soviet Union had never achieved. Equally disconcerting were the portrayals of the scientists involved. Names such as Oppenheimer, Fermi, and Teller were mentioned in reports, alongside illustrations of their respective roles. Soviet officers were taken aback to discover that many of these individuals were European immigrants, refugees fleeing fascism, who had brought with them the continent's most sophisticated knowledge. To the officers, it felt as though history itself had betrayed them. While Europe was being devastated, its most brilliant minds had sought refuge in the West to serve under American flags. The Soviet Union, drained by the war, had not only lost millions of soldiers but also the intellectual competition that had now come to define global power. When senior officers perused descriptions of the bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, they were struck by the technical accuracy. Intelligence operatives had provided sketches of implosion mechanisms, reports on critical masses, and yield estimates. These were not mere rumors exchanged in taverns. They were blueprints for destruction. Soviet officers, who had orchestrated tank offensives across the expansive plains of Ukraine, now found themselves examining diagrams of spherical charges intended to compress plutonium into a critical state. They realized that warfare had transitioned from maneuvers across continents to the splitting of an atom. In hushed conversations, officers confessed something they would never document: awe. Despite their animosity towards American imperialism, they could not help but admire the accomplishment. To harness the fundamental forces of nature and unleash them upon cities required a level of power, both scientific and organizational, that was unparalleled. It was indeed terrifying, yet it also served as evidence of what humanity could achieve when knowledge and resources aligned. For Soviet officers, it represented both inspiration and a nightmare. By early 1946, these insights influenced every military strategy discussion in Moscow. Officers began to focus less on divisions and more on deterrence. If America were capable of constructing such weapons, how many more could it potentially manufacture? 10, 50, 100. And if each weapon had the capacity to annihilate a city, what prospects did the Soviet Union have for survival? The Red Army had advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin through valor, sacrifice, and sheer numbers. Yet against a stockpile of nuclear bombs, none of that would hold significance. For the first time, the officers recognized that triumph in warfare might no longer be determined by the side with the greatest number of soldiers, but rather by the side possessing the most secrets. By 1946, Soviet officers were no longer simply astonished by the existence of the bomb or the magnitude of the Manhattan Project. What troubled them during the night were the reports continuously arriving regarding America's ongoing nuclear experiments, tests conducted in deserts and remote atolls. Each test served as a chilling exhibition of power. From their perspective in Moscow, these officers constructed a narrative of a United States that was not complacently resting on the achievements of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but was actively augmenting its arsenal and experimenting with new methods of destruction. To them, every mushroom cloud emerging over Nevada or the Pacific was not merely an experiment. It was a cautionary signal sent across the seas. Soviet intelligence agents embedded within consulates, trade missions, and scientific communities transmitted fragmented accounts of these explosions. Some reports detailed blinding flashes visible hundreds of miles away, while others described shock waves that shattered windows in small desert towns. In the instance of the Bikini Atoll tests in 1946, the information that reached Moscow was especially concerning. Agents recounted how the U.S. Navy had gathered a fleet of outdated battleships, carriers, and cruisers only to annihilate them with a single nuclear detonation. For Soviet officers who had fought fiercely to protect every ship of their battered navy, the notion of casually sacrificing an entire fleet to test a bomb was indicative of America's immense confidence and resources. These examinations also uncovered a more sinister reality. America was not merely refining its capacity for destruction, but was also analyzing every aspect of it. Reports from sources within scientific circles indicated that American researchers were diligently recording radiation levels, blast pressures, and the bomb's impact on materials such as steel, concrete, and even living creatures. There were rumors that pigs and goats had been secured to the decks of ships at Bikini, subjected to the agonizing burns and radiation to yield data. For Soviet officials, this validated their belief that the Americans were gearing up for warfare, not just theoretically but practically, amassing the expertise necessary to obliterate an adversary with scientific accuracy. As Soviet officers processed these reports, they came to understand that America's nuclear initiative was not a fixed accomplishment. Each test signified advancement, enhancement, and a growing stockpile. Within the corridors of Soviet military academies, instructors cautioned cadets that the Americans were already testing bombs that were larger and more lethal than those unleashed on Japan. Rumors circulated about super bombs that were exponentially more powerful than those used in Hiroshima, weapons capable of decimating not only cities but entire regions. Officers who were once focused on calculating artillery ranges and tank formations began to draw circles on maps of Europe, envisioning areas of devastation that could engulf entire nations. The psychological impact was profound. Officers who had previously carried themselves with the confidence of victors now exhibited a subdued anxiety. Their minds were consumed by the fear that everything they had fought for could be obliterated in mere moments. The Red Army's victorious advance into Berlin just a year prior appeared almost trivial in light of the American tests conducted in the Pacific. If the Americans could annihilate fleets and islands at will, what hope did Soviet forces have of maintaining control in Eastern Europe? For the first time, the looming threat of total destruction overshadowed every military strategy. Adding to their anxiety were rumors suggesting that America was contemplating the use of the bomb as a means of diplomatic intimidation. Reports emerged of U.S. generals nonchalantly boasting in private discussions that Moscow or Leningrad could meet the same fate as Hiroshima if the Soviet Union exceeded its limits. Whether these claims were genuine or exaggerated was of little consequence. The officers accepted them as truth. For them, every mushroom cloud in the Nevada desert represented a rehearsal for war, and every test at Bikini served as a covert warning. Defy American power at your own risk. Behind closed doors, discussions intensified. Some officers contended that America would never dare to use the bomb against the Soviet Union, fearing a global backlash. Others countered that the United States had already demonstrated its willingness to unleash such devastation in Japan, and that nothing could stop it from doing so again. What was universally acknowledged was that Soviet survival necessitated a response. Either the Soviet Union would develop its own bomb, or it would perpetually exist under the shadow of America's nuclear dominance. For the officers who had witnessed Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin, the notion of their homeland's fate resting on America's experiments in far-off deserts was unbearable. By late 1946, the Soviet officer corps had come to accept a grim reality. America's nuclear program was not a singular accomplishment frozen in time, but rather a dynamic, evolving force. Each test explosion served as a stark reminder that the divide between the two superpowers was expanding with each passing month. The officers recognized with chilling clarity that their nation's survival hinged not on infantry divisions or tank fleets, but on the capability of Soviet scientists to replicate what America had accomplished. And until that replication was achieved, every flash in the desert and every mushroom cloud over the Pacific would remain a haunting reminder of their vulnerability. By the winter of 1946 into 1947, the Soviet officer corps found itself grappling with a harsh and undeniable truth. Their own arsenal was significantly lacking when compared to the capabilities already held by America. For leaders who had commanded millions of troops through the intense battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, it was a humbling, nearly humiliating realization to acknowledge that the formidable Red Army, which had successfully worn down Hitler's Wehrmacht, could be rendered strategically insignificant by a mere handful of American aircraft equipped with atomic bombs. In their private meetings and confidential documents, Soviet generals grappled with the challenge of reconciling their hard-won battlefield triumphs with the emerging era of nuclear warfare. The contrasts were striking. Soviet officers were used to boasting about the Red Army's tanks, artillery, and manpower, emphasizing that even amidst the devastation of war, the USSR could still mobilize millions of soldiers and thousands of machines. However, when intelligence reports indicated that America had the capacity to produce dozens of bombs within a few short years, those claims lost their weight. What value did infantry divisions or tank brigades hold if an adversary could obliterate entire command centers with a single strike? Officers who had dedicated their entire lives to strategies of attrition and mass mobilization now confronted a completely new reality. Survival was no longer reliant on sheer numbers, but rather on technology that the Soviets had yet to acquire. Reports circulated among the general staff comparing Soviet scientific advancements to those of the Americans. Physicists, such as Igor Khatov, were laboring under immense pressure. Yet even the most optimistic projections indicated that the Soviet Union was at least several years behind. Officers read with increasing anxiety about how American laboratories had already perfected implosion mechanisms, tested various bomb designs, and enhanced uranium enrichment capabilities. Meanwhile, Soviet resources were constrained. Industries were still in the process of recovering from devastation, and infrastructure was pushed to its limits. It was disheartening for proud commanders to come to terms with the fact that their armies, which had triumphantly marched into Berlin, now found themselves vulnerable against a nation located across the ocean. Some officers attempted to find solace in geography. They contended that the vastness of Russia and its extensive hinterlands would serve as a shield. However, even this notion disintegrated upon closer examination. Maps depicting Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and other significant urban centers were circled to indicate potential blast zones. If America were to strike at the industrial and political core of the Soviet Union, no amount of landmass could provide protection. Others proposed that anti-aircraft systems might intercept bombers, yet intelligence revealed that the Americans were already advancing long-range bombers capable of reaching Soviet cities with relative ease. The officers' pride in their wartime accomplishments was being supplanted by a troubling fear that in the next conflict, the USSR might not even have the opportunity to engage in battle. Comparisons of economic output only intensified the gloom. During the war, America had overwhelmed the Axis powers with an unending supply of resources: trucks, planes, fuel, and food. Now those same industrial strengths were being redirected towards atomic production. Officers perused reports estimating that the Manhattan Project's costs had surpassed $2 billion, a figure exceeding the entire Soviet defense budget in certain years. The lesson was starkly evident. America's economy could support both conventional and nuclear dominance, while the Soviet Union struggled to reconstruct devastated cities and nourish its populace. The disparity appeared insurmountable. This understanding profoundly influenced military strategy. The doctrine of deep operations, the Red Army's esteemed innovation of large-scale offensives aimed at overwhelming adversaries through momentum, suddenly seemed outdated. How could one strategize a sweeping armored advance across Europe when a single American bomb could obliterate the offensive at its inception? Officers who had dedicated their careers to mastering maneuver warfare were now compelled to envision scenarios where the initial act of conflict would result in their destruction from the air. War planning shifted focus from aggression to survival, an unfamiliar and disconcerting transition for a military shaped by offensive strategies. In their private reflections, some officers expressed feelings of betrayal by history itself. They had sacrificed millions of lives to defeat Germany, only to find that their supposed ally had utilized the war as a pretext to advance into an entirely new realm of power. The victory in Berlin, the parades, the medals all seemed diminished in light of America's nuclear supremacy. For younger officers, it served as a sobering lesson. Glory in conventional warfare no longer ensured security. For the older generation, it represented an almost existential dilemma. They had fought and triumphed in the greatest war in history. Yet now they were compelled to acknowledge that their victory might already be rendered obsolete. By 1947, the consensus was starkly evident. The Soviet Union possessed no weapon capable of matching America's arsenal. Until their scientists could produce an atomic bomb of their own, the officer corps existed in a perpetual state of anxiety, cognizant that they commanded millions of soldiers who might never have the opportunity to engage in battle before the sky itself rendered judgment. Their pride as victors of the Great Patriotic War now intertwined with the harsh reality that in the nuclear era, they were unprepared and vulnerable. By the year 1947, Soviet officers had begun to contemplate the broader geopolitical ramifications of America's nuclear dominance. In strategic meetings, in handwritten notes, and in quiet discussions behind closed Kremlin doors, they considered chilling scenarios of what might transpire if a conflict arose between the two emerging superpowers. The officers were not naive. They had witnessed firsthand the devastation wrought by mechanized warfare across the Eastern Front. Yet, none of that equipped them for the realization that a mere handful of American aircraft could obliterate the Soviet Union's major cities within hours. Europe, newly partitioned between Soviet and Western spheres, became the focal point of these haunting visions. Maps were spread out on extensive oak tables in war rooms, with red circles drawn over Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, and Vienna, each indicating the projected blast radius of a bomb equivalent to that of Hiroshima. If America decided to utilize its arsenal, officers noted with grim determination, the positions of the Red Army in Eastern Europe could be obliterated before they had a chance to mobilize. The focus had shifted from the number of tanks that could traverse the Ila or the divisions that could surge through the Fula Gap to a question of survival against imminent destruction from above. The most chilling conversations revolved around Moscow itself. Soviet officers envisioned the capital, the epicenter of the revolution and the seat of power, being annihilated in mere seconds. The Kremlin, the General Staff, the ministries, all would vanish in a single blinding flash. Without Moscow, the coordination of defense would disintegrate instantaneously. Leningrad, still bearing the scars of the siege, was another clear target, as was Kiev, whose industrial sectors were crucial for Soviet recovery. The officers recognized that America's bombs were not merely instruments of warfare, but rather tools of decapitation, capable of obliterating leadership, infrastructure, and morale in one fell swoop. In the face of such a peril, conventional defenses appeared absurdly insufficient. The unease was further heightened by America's overt confidence. Intelligence reports intercepted speeches from American generals who boasted of their nation's capacity to strike anywhere across the globe. Military publications in the West candidly explored the notion of atomic diplomacy, proposing that nuclear weapons could influence international relations in the same manner that cannons once did. Soviet officers perusing these articles grasped that their nation was no longer evaluated based on the might of its armies, but rather by the lack of a nuclear deterrent. The balance of power in Europe had shifted overnight, and not in their favor. Some officers endeavored to conceive countermeasures. Could extensive networks of subterranean bunkers safeguard Soviet command centers? Could urban areas be decentralized to lessen vulnerability? Concepts were drafted, yet most were deemed impractical. The magnitude of devastation was simply too immense, even if leaders survived underground. What value was survival if the nation above lay in ruins? The Red Army had been designed to combat invasions across expansive plains, but the nuclear era threatened to make geography irrelevant. The strategic consequences for Europe were dire. Soviet strategists understood that their grip on Eastern Europe, hard-won through bloodshed and conquest, could be shattered if America opted to utilize its arsenal. Western Europe, supported by American defense, could resist Soviet influence with significantly greater assurance. Officers murmured ominously that the equilibrium of power had been usurped not by diplomacy or numbers, but by scientific advancements and technology that the Soviet Union had failed to keep pace with in time. In their more somber moments, some officers conceded that the atomic bomb rendered all their sacrifices seem futile. The tens of millions who perished, the obliterated cities, the relentless marches from Stalingrad to Berlin, all of it could be wiped away in moments if America decided to unleash its might. This notion, perhaps more than any other, gnawed at the pride of the Soviet military elite. Victory had never seemed so tenuous. By late 1947, Soviet officers reached a unanimous conclusion. Unless the Soviet Union attained nuclear parity, their nation's standing in Europe was precarious. Conventional forces, regardless of their size, could not protect them from the emerging American supremacy. The era of infantry and artillery was yielding to an era of atomic dread. The officers who once gauged strength by the quantity of tanks on the battlefield now assessed it by the number of bombs in America's arsenal. And in those assessments, Europe appeared not as a territory to be defended, but as a battleground already fated for annihilation in the initial moments of any conflict. By 1948, the mood among Soviet officers had transformed from a state of stunned despair to one of grim determination. While America's nuclear arsenal had exposed the USSR's weaknesses, it also brought a harsh clarity. Survival necessitated the development of a Soviet bomb. Consequently, one of the most intense mobilizations in Soviet history ensued. This campaign saw officers taking on pivotal roles not only as military overseers, but also as protectors of secrecy, discipline, and security. Orders were issued directly by Stalin, whose silence following Hiroshima had masked months of meticulous planning. Now he demanded tangible results. The officers responsible for executing his orders witnessed firsthand the vast mobilization of resources. Entire institutes were reorganized, secret laboratories were constructed, uranium mines were secured as if they were treasures, and the nation's most brilliant scientific minds were compelled to work under conditions of extreme secrecy. Igor Khatov, regarded as the father of the Soviet atomic program, became a name spoken of with great respect, while Lenti Beria, the head of the NKVD, managed the project with ruthless efficiency. Soviet officers who were used to commanding troops now found themselves overseeing trains laden with precious metals, escorting scientists to isolated facilities, and enforcing a level of silence more profound than anything they had previously experienced. The urgency was unmistakable. Officers received reports of America continuing its tests, developing larger bombs, more efficient designs, and even whispers of weapons that could potentially be delivered by long-range rockets in the future. Each new test heightened the pressure in Moscow, propelling the Soviet program forward with almost frantic urgency. Soldiers who once guarded borders now monitored uranium enrichment plants in the Urals. Generals, who were accustomed to inspecting divisions, now examined laboratories, scrutinizing equipment they barely understood but recognized as the future of warfare. The sense of mission was unwavering: to close the gap with America before it was too late. Secrecy became an obsession. Officers implemented protocols with strict authority, guaranteeing that every discussion, every shipment, and every experiment remained concealed from foreign observation. To disclose information was considered the gravest form of treason, punishable not only by death, but also by the devastation of entire families. The threat of espionage was ever present. Soviet officers understood that just as their spies had infiltrated the Manhattan Project, American agents would be eager to undermine their own initiatives. Special units protected every facility, equipped not only with rifles but also with directives to shoot without hesitation if sabotage was suspected. The circumstances under which scientists operated shocked even the most seasoned officers. Facilities were rapidly erected in remote areas where winters were harsh and resources limited. Scientists toiled incessantly, often under tremendous psychological strain, aware that failure was not an option. Many officers who were used to commanding troops in combat now found themselves responsible for inspiring scientists rather than soldiers. It was an awkward blend of military discipline and intellectual innovation, but under Stalin's vigilant supervision, it was the only viable course. The responsibilities of Soviet officers went beyond simple oversight. They also coordinated logistics on a national level. Uranium ore extracted in Central Asia needed to be transported over thousands of kilometers under armed protection, processed in plants that consumed enormous amounts of energy, and delivered to laboratories for additional experimentation. Each segment of this operation required meticulous coordination, and officers ensured that every train, every convoy, and every shipment arrived punctually. In their reports, some officers privately acknowledged that the entire endeavor felt akin to preparing for a new type of warfare. One fought not on traditional battlefields but in laboratories, with scientists as the soldiers and uranium as their ammunition. For many officers, this transition was profoundly disconcerting. They had devoted their lives to conventional warfare, becoming proficient in artillery barges, armored assaults, and infantry tactics. Now they found themselves relegated to the position of guardians of secrets they scarcely comprehended. Nevertheless, as they grappled with the unfamiliarity of their responsibilities, they acknowledged the seriousness of their undertaking. Without their diligence, the Soviet Union might never advance, leaving the millions of men in the Red Army vulnerable against America's nuclear power. By 1948 and into 1949, the Soviet officer corps faced relentless pressure. They bore the burden of an entire nation's survival, safeguarding the scientists, the resources, and the delicate progress toward developing their own bomb. Each day that elapsed without achievement was yet another day spent in America's shadow. However, amid the anxiety there was also a glimmer of pride. They were involved in something monumental, a project that, if successful, would restore equilibrium to the world and erase the shame of powerlessness. The officers understood that the stakes could not be higher. This was not merely about triumph in a future conflict. It was about guaranteeing that there would be a future at all. Thus, they persevered through the long nights. The secrecy and the constant vigilance, aware that the day the Soviet Union conducted its first bomb test would mark the moment the Red Army finally regained equal standing. By the summer of 1949, the Soviet Union was on the verge of its most significant accomplishment since the victory over Nazi Germany. For Soviet officers who had spent the preceding 4 years living under the shadow of America's nuclear dominance, the tension was nearly intolerable. They had endured years of fear, secrecy, and preparation, protecting uranium convoys, supervising the scientists' progress, and quelling even the slightest rumor that could alert the outside world. Now, at last, the long-anticipated test was imminent. At the remote Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, Soviet officers observed as the final arrangements were completed. Barracks, observation posts, and bunkers had been constructed in the barren steppe, while measuring devices were positioned throughout the test area. Entire villages had been evacuated under military directives, with their inhabitants resettled without any explanation. For the officers in charge of security, it served as an unsettling reminder of wartime evacuations. However, this time, the adversary was not the Wehrmacht. It was the unseen burden of expectation. They understood that if the bomb succeeded, the Soviet Union would finally emerge from beneath America's shadow. Conversely, if it failed, the repercussions could be disastrous, both politically and militarily. On the morning of August 29, 1949, officers convened with scientists behind thick protective glass in fortified bunkers. As the countdown progressed, a hush enveloped the room. The subsequent explosion, dubbed First Lightning, was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. A dazzling flash lit up the steppe, followed by a towering mushroom cloud that resembled the images they had obsessively studied from Hiroshima and Bikini. Instruments validated what their eyes had already confirmed. The Soviet Union had successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. In that instant, the officers felt the suffocating weight of helplessness dissipate, replaced by a fierce, nearly triumphant pride. They had narrowed the gap. For many officers, the detonation rekindled memories of the past 4 years. The relentless flow of intelligence reports highlighting American dominance, the chilling speculation of Soviet cities obliterated in mere minutes, the humiliation of realizing that their divisions and artillery were powerless against nuclear devastation. Now at last, they could envision a world where the Soviet Union was not subservient to America's arsenal. Nuclear parity was still a distant goal, but the monopoly had been shattered. In Moscow, the news initially spread cautiously, limited to Stalin's inner circle and the officer corps entrusted with the most sensitive secrets. When confirmation arrived that America's espionage networks had detected the explosion, the officers permitted themselves a quiet sense of satisfaction. They not only accomplished what was deemed impossible, but they also did so earlier than many in Washington had anticipated. For the first time since 1945, Soviet officers sensed a slight shift in the balance of power in their favor. However, this victory was accompanied by a sobering realization. The officers recognized that the arms race was just beginning. America still maintained a significantly larger arsenal, with more bombs and advanced designs already in the pipeline. The achievement of the Soviet Union was historic, yet it represented merely the initial step in what would evolve into an unyielding competition. Some officers experienced exhilaration, while others felt apprehension, but all concurred that the future of warfare, diplomacy, and survival would now be quantified in kilotons and megatons. In private discussions, officers confessed how deeply the years of America's nuclear dominance had impacted them. The dread of total destruction, the images of Moscow and Leningrad engulfed in nuclear flames, the overwhelming sense of powerlessness while they oversaw countless soldiers who may never engage in combat. All these recollections persisted even as the Soviet bomb ascended above the steppe. They recounted the sleepless nights when updates from Bikini and Nevada kept them alert, the painful contrasts to America's affluence and industrial might, and the humiliation of realizing their forces could be obliterated before a single shot was fired. The successful detonation did not erase those years of anxiety, yet it imbued them with significance. For the officer corps, the bomb represented more than just a weapon. It was evidence that the Soviet Union could not be cowed, that the sacrifices made during the Great Patriotic War had not been futile. It assured them that Moscow would not yield to American intimidation. The mushroom cloud over Kazakhstan emerged as a symbol, a proclamation that the Soviet Union would assert itself as an equal in the nuclear era. Thus, as the dust settled on the steppe and the first Soviet atomic bomb etched itself into history, Soviet officers gazed toward the future with renewed assurance. They recognized that the struggle was far from concluded, but they also understood they would never again experience the paralyzing shock of 1945. The balance of terror had commenced, and for the first time they felt prepared to confront it.